Detective Sarah Martinez gripped the steering wheel tighter as she pulled into the Sunset Gardens apartment complex at 11:47 p.m. The flickering neon sign cast eerie shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot, and broken glass crunched under her patrol car's tires. This wasn't her first visit to Building C. Drug calls were routine in this forgotten corner of Phoenix, Arizona, but something about tonight felt different. The anonymous tip had been specific. Apartment 4B, Miguel Rodriguez. Armed and dangerous. Child on premises. "Ready, boy?" she whispered to Rex, her 4-year-old German Shepherd partner, who sat alert in the back seat. His ears perked forward, sensing the tension in her voice. Rex had been with the Phoenix PD K-9 unit for 3 years, specializing in narcotics detection, and his track record was impeccable. 43 successful drug busts, 12 weapons recoveries, and 0 injuries to officers under his watch. Tonight, that record would change everything. Martinez checked her radio one final time. Unit 47 on scene at Sunset Gardens. "Backup ETA?" "5 minutes out," came the crackling response from dispatch. "Proceed with caution, Martinez." Suspect has priors for assault with a deadly weapon. She couldn't wait. The tip mentioned a child inside, and every second counted when kids were involved. Martinez had joined the force 8 years ago, specifically because of cases like this. She'd grown up in similar circumstances, watching her own father destroy their family with drugs and violence. The badge on her chest represented more than law enforcement. It was her chance to break cycles that trapped innocent children. The apartment complex's dim hallway reeked of cigarettes, mold, and desperation. Martinez counted the doors. 4A, music, thumping behind thin walls. 4B, eerily quiet. She positioned Rex beside her, his muscular frame coiled and ready. Through the peephole's faint light, she glimpsed movement inside. A man's voice shouted something in Spanish, followed by a child's frightened whimper that made her blood run cold. "Phoenix Police, open up!" Martinez pounded on the door with her gloved fist. Silence, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, running toward the back of the apartment, and something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Miguel Rodriguez, we have a warrant. Open the door. Now." The response was a gunshot that splintered the door frame inches from her head. Martinez dove to the side, pulling Rex with her. Shots fired. "Officer needs assistance at Sunset Gardens, Building C, Apartment 4B. Her heart hammered as she drew her service weapon, adrenaline flooding her system. Behind the door, she heard a man cursing and what sounded like furniture being overturned. But underneath it all was a sound that haunted her, a small child crying. Without hesitation, Martinez kicked the door. It flew open, revealing chaos inside. The living room was a disaster zone. Drug paraphernalia scattered across a coffee table, white powder spilled on the floor, scales and plastic bags everywhere. Miguel Rodriguez, a thin man with wild eyes and needle-marked arms, stood in the kitchen doorway with a .38 revolver pointed at her chest. "Stay back," he screamed, his hand shaking violently. "I ain't going back to prison. I can't leave her." That's when Martinez saw her, a tiny figure huddled behind the couch, arms wrapped around her knees. Emma Rodriguez couldn't have been more than 3 years old, wearing a pink nightgown covered in cartoon unicorns that seemed obscenely innocent in this hellscape. Her dark eyes, wide with terror, darted between her father and the armed police officer who had just burst through their door. "Miguel, put the gun down," Martinez said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Think about Emma. She doesn't need to see this." Rex remained perfectly still beside her, trained not to move without command, or ready to act in milliseconds. The dog's presence seemed to register with Emma, who stopped crying and stared at the massive German shepherd with fascination rather than fear. "You don't understand," Miguel sobbed, the gun wavering. "They're coming for her. If I go away, they'll take her. I'm all she's got left since Maria died." Martinez knew about Maria Rodriguez. Emma's mother had overdosed 6 months ago, leaving Miguel as the child's sole guardian. Social services had investigated twice, but found no evidence of abuse or neglect. The apartment might be a drug den, but Miguel had apparently kept that world separate from his daughter. Until tonight. "Nobody's taking Emma anywhere she doesn't belong," Martinez lied smoothly. "But she needs you alive, Miguel. Put the gun down, and we'll figure this out." For a moment, she thought he might comply. Miguel's shoulders sagged, and the gun lowered slightly. Emma whimpered from behind the couch, "Daddy?" That single word shattered Miguel's fragile composure. His face contorted with rage and desperation as he raised the weapon again. "I won't let them destroy her like they destroyed us." Rex moved before Martinez could give the command. The dog launched himself across the room in a blur of black and tan fur, his 80-pound frame colliding with Miguel's chest. The gun fired. Wild, the bullet embedding in the ceiling as both man and dog crashed to the floor. Rex's jaws clamped down on Miguel's wrist, not breaking bone, but applying enough pressure to force him to drop the weapon. Emma's scream pierced the night, a sound of pure terror that would echo in Martinez's dreams for months to come. The little girl watched her father being pinned down by a snarling police dog, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle, blood seeping from Rex's controlled bite. "Don't take my daddy," Emma shrieked, running toward them with her arms outstretched. "Please don't take my daddy away." Those would be the last coherent words Emma Rodriguez spoke for the next 4 months, as trauma locked her voice away in a place so deep that even the most experienced child psychologists couldn't reach her. Martinez holstered her weapon and gently restrained the hysterical child, while Rex maintained control over Miguel, who had stopped fighting and lay sobbing on the debris-covered floor. Through the shattered doorway, backup officers flooded in, but the real damage was already done. As Miguel Rodriguez was loaded into the ambulance under arrest for assault on a police officer, drug possession with intent to distribute, and child endangerment, Emma stood silently beside her temporary social worker, her small hand clutching the unicorn nightgown. She stared at Martinez and Rex with an expression that would haunt the detective forever. Not anger, not fear, but complete and utter betrayal. The night everything changed had ended, but Emma's nightmare was just beginning. 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Dr. Patricia Hoffman had been counting every single day since Emma Rodriguez had last spoken a word. The child psychologist sat across from the 3-year-old in her carefully designed office, watching. As Emma methodically arranged wooden blocks into perfect rows, then knocked them down, then started again. The repetitive behavior had become Emma's only form of communication, a silent language of destruction and rebuilding that mirrored the chaos in her young mind. "Emma, sweetie," Dr. Hoffman said gently, placing a new set of colorful animal figures on the low table between them. "Would you like to play with the farm animals today?" Emma's dark eyes flicked toward the toys for a fraction of a second before returning to her blocks. Her tiny hands moved with mechanical precision stack, align, destroy, repeat. She wore a yellow sundress that her grandmother Rosa had bought her, hoping bright colors might lift the child's spirits. Instead, Emma looked like a small ghost, haunting her own life. Rosa Rodriguez sat in the corner, her weathered hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. At 62, she had raised 5 children of her own, but nothing had prepared her for this. Emma had been living with her since that terrible night, and the silence was suffocating. A vibrant, chattering little girl who used to sing nursery rhymes, and ask endless questions about butterflies and clouds had vanished, replaced by this hollow-eyed stranger who flinched at loud noises and refused to sleep without every light. In the house turned on. "Doctor," Rosa whispered, her voice thick with desperation and exhaustion. "Is she ever going to talk again? It's been so long, and I don't know what to do anymore. She won't eat unless I feed her like a baby. She wakes up screaming every night. Yesterday, she saw a police car on TV and threw herself under the kitchen table." Dr. Hoffman had been treating traumatized children for 15 years, but Emma's case was among the most severe she'd encountered. Post-traumatic stress disorder in children, this young was particularly complex because they lacked the cognitive tools to process and verbalize their experiences. Emma had witnessed her father's violent arrest, seen him bleeding and screaming, while being attacked by a police dog, and then been separated from the only parent she had left. For a 3-year-old, it was an incomprehensible betrayal by the adults who were supposed to protect her. Selective mutism following trauma is not uncommon, Dr. Hoffman explained, though she'd given this same explanation dozens of times over the past months. Emma's mind has essentially shut down her ability to speak as a protective mechanism. She's trapped inside her own consciousness, trying to make sense of something that no child should ever have to witness. Through her office window, Dr. Hoffman could see the parking lot where news vans had been stationed for weeks after Emma's story broke. The media had dubbed her the Silent Angel, turning her trauma into a sensational headline. Reporters had hounded Rosa, offering money for interviews and exclusive photos. The attention had forced them to move twice, seeking refuge in different apartments across Phoenix, but the story followed them everywhere. The real tragedy, Dr. Hoffman knew, was happening 30 miles away in the Maricopa County Prosecutor's office, where Assistant District Attorney James Chan was facing the collapse of what should have been an open and shut drug trafficking case. She had received multiple calls from his office, pressure mounting for her to break through to Emma, to somehow unlock the testimony that could put Miguel Rodriguez and his associates behind bars for decades. "The thing is," Rosa continued, tears beginning to flow, "Miguel wasn't always like this. Before Maria died, before the drugs got so bad, he was a good father. Emma adored him. She would wait by the window every evening for him to come home from work. When he walked through that door, her whole face would light up like Christmas morning." Dr. Hoffman made notes on her pad, documenting Emma's continued regression. The child had stopped making eye contact entirely last week, and now she was exhibiting signs of selective eating disorder as well. Rosa had mentioned that Emma would only consume white foods, milk, bread, rice, as if color itself had become threatening. "Have you considered that Emma might not be just traumatized by what happened to her father?" Dr. Hoffman asked carefully, "but also by what she witnessed before the police arrived?" A 911 call mentioned sounds of violence and shouting that had been going on for over an hour before Detective Martinez reached the scene. Rosa's face paled. "You think someone hurt Miguel before the police got there?" "The lawyers keep asking me about that, but Emma never said anything about other people being in the apartment. Emma hasn't said anything about anything," Dr. Hoffman pointed out gently. "But sometimes trauma responses can give us clues about the specific nature of what a child experienced. Emma's particular fear responses, the way she reacts to dogs, not just police, but all dogs, and her panic attacks when she hears men arguing, suggest her trauma may have multiple layers." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma suddenly looked up from her blocks. For the first time in weeks, she made direct eye contact with Dr. Hoffman. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were trying to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she pointed toward the office window, where a German shepherd was walking past with its owner. Emma's entire body began to shake. She knocked over all her carefully arranged blocks and dove behind Rosa's chair, making the first sound she had. Produced in months a low, keening whimper that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. "It's okay, baby," Rosa soothed, reaching down to stroke Emma's hair. "It's just a dog walking by. It can't hurt you." But Dr. Hoffman was taking furious notes. Emma's reaction wasn't general fear. It was specific recognition. The child was remembering something particular about a dog, something that had happened before Detective Martinez and Rex had entered her life. Something that might be the key to understanding not just Emma's trauma, but the entire truth about that night in apartment 4B. Outside, the German Shepherd disappeared from view, but Emma remained hidden behind her grandmother's chair, trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. Dr. Hoffman closed her notebook and made a decision that would change everything. It was time to call Detective Martinez. If Emma was going to heal, if she was ever going to speak again, they needed to understand exactly what she had witnessed. And that meant reconstructing every moment of that terrible night, including the parts that nobody had talked about yet. The silent witness might not be able to speak, but her trauma was telling a story that someone needed to hear. The headline blazed across the front page of the Arizona Republic in bold, sensationalized letters. "The Silent Angel. Traumatized tot holds key to major drug bust." Below it, a grainy photograph showed Emma Rodriguez being carried from the courthouse by her grandmother, her small face buried against Rosa's shoulder to hide from the cameras. The image had gone viral within hours, spawning dozens of copycat articles and turning a 3-year-old's nightmare into national entertainment. Detective Sarah Martinez crumpled the newspaper in disgust as she sat in her patrol car outside Rosa Rodriguez's latest apartment, their third move in as many months. Each relocation an attempt to escape the media circus that seemed to follow them everywhere. The modest complex in South Phoenix was a far cry from the upscale neighborhood where Rosa had lived before becoming Emma's guardian, but it was all she could afford on her part-time housekeeping salary while caring for a traumatized child. Martinez checked her watch. 3:30 p.m. She had been making these unofficial visits twice a week for the past month, driven by a guilt that gnawed at her insides like acid. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emma's terrified face from that night, heard her desperate plea, "Don't take my daddy away." The department psychologist had assured her that she'd acted appropriately, that Rex's intervention had saved lives, but logic couldn't silence the voice in her head that whispered she was responsible for destroying an innocent child's world. Rex sat in the back seat, his ears perked forward as he sensed Martinez's tension. The German Shepherd had been unusually restless lately, as if he too carried the weight of that night. Canine handlers often developed deep emotional bonds with their partners, and Martinez knew Rex could sense her distress. What she hadn't expected was how the dog seemed to remember Emma specifically. Every time they approached Rosa's building, Rex would whine softly and pace in his kennel, behavior that was completely out of character for the normally disciplined police dog. The apartment door opened before Martinez could knock. Rosa Rodriguez looked exhausted, her graying hair pulled back in a messy bun, her clothes wrinkled from what had clearly been another sleepless night. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of months spent caring for a child who woke screaming from nightmares, who refused to eat, who hadn't spoken a word since witnessing her father's arrest. "Detective Martinez," Rosa said quietly, glancing nervously down the hallway. "I wasn't expecting you today." "I know it's not our usual day," Martinez replied, "but I've been thinking about something Dr. Hoffman mentioned, about Emma's specific reactions to dogs. I was hoping maybe Rex could help somehow." Rosa's face softened slightly. Of all the authority figures who had invaded their lives, social workers, prosecutors, therapists, reporters, Detective Martinez was the only one who seemed to genuinely care about Emma's well-being rather than what the child might be able to provide for their respective agendas. "She's in her room," Rosa whispered, leading Martinez inside. "She's been drawing again. The same pictures, over and over." The small living room was immaculate, despite their circumstances. Rosa had always taken pride in keeping a clean home, but evidence of Emma's trauma was everywhere. Child-proof locks had been installed on every cabinet and door after Emma had tried to hide in increasingly dangerous places. Thick curtains blocked out most of the sunlight because Emma now feared shadows. The television had been removed entirely after Emma's panic attack during a dog food commercial. On the coffee table lay dozens of drawings created with broken crayons, the only art supplies Rosa could afford. Martinez studied them with growing unease. Each picture showed the same disturbing elements: a small figure cowering, while large dark shapes loomed overhead. In some drawings, the shapes had teeth. In others, they had badges. Emma's artistic ability was remarkable for a 3-year-old, but her subjects were the stuff of nightmares. "Dr. Hoffman thinks these represent her memories," Rosa explained, picking up one particularly haunting image. "But they don't make sense to me. This one shows 3 dogs, but there was only Rex that night, wasn't there?" Martinez felt ice forming in her stomach as she examined the drawing more carefully. Rosa was right. Emma had drawn 3 distinct canine figures, each with different markings and sizes. One resembled Rex with his German Shepherd coloring, but the other 2 were different breeds entirely. One appeared to be a pit bull, muscular and intimidating. The other looked like a Rottweiler, massive and menacing. "Rosa," Martinez said slowly, her detective instincts suddenly razor-sharp, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully. When you got the call that night about Emma being taken into protective custody, did anyone mention how long the disturbance had been going on before we arrived?" Rosa frowned, trying to remember details from the most traumatic night of her life. The social worker said neighbors had been calling in noise complaints for hours. Shouting, banging, dogs barking. Everyone assumed it was just Miguel being, well, Miguel. He'd been getting worse since Maria died, more paranoid, more violent. "Dogs barking," Martinez repeated. Plural. Before Rosa could respond, a small sound from the hallway made them both turn. Emma stood in the doorway to her bedroom, clutching her worn teddy bear and staring directly at Rex, who had remained quietly beside Martinez throughout their conversation. For the first time since that terrible night, Emma's expression wasn't one of pure terror. Instead, she looked curious. Rex, displaying the emotional intelligence that made him such an effective canine partner, lowered himself to the floor and rested his head on his paws, making himself appear as non-threatening as possible. Emma took one tentative step forward, then another. "Emma, baby," Rosa breathed, afraid to move and shatter the moment. Emma walked slowly across the room, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet. When she reached Rex, she did something that made both women gasp. She extended her tiny hand and gently touched the top of his head. Rex remained perfectly still, his tail giving the slightest wag of encouragement. For 30 seconds, child and dog remained frozen in that tableau. Then Emma opened her mouth, and Martinez held her breath, hoping against hope that this might be the breakthrough everyone had been praying for. Instead, Emma turned to Martinez and pointed at Rex, then at her disturbing drawings scattered across the coffee table. Her message was clear, even without words. Rex wasn't the dog she was afraid of. He was the dog she recognized. The dog she remembered from the most traumatic night of her life. But if Rex wasn't the source of her terror, then who were the other? Dogs in her drawings? And what had really happened in apartment 4B before the police arrived? Martinez realized with growing horror that they had all been asking the wrong questions. Emma wasn't traumatized by what she had seen the police do to her father. She was traumatized by what she had seen someone else do to him first. The silent witness was trying to tell them about a crime within a crime. And finally, someone was starting to listen. The courthouse steps of Maricopa County Superior Court buzzed with activity as defense attorney Michael Burke adjusted his navy blue tie and prepared to deliver what he hoped would be a career-defining performance. Flanked by child advocacy groups, holding signs reading, "Protect Emma," and "Children are not evidence," Burke surveyed the sea of reporters and cameras with the satisfied expression of a man who knew he held all the cards. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Burke began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had spent 15 years defending the accused and attacking the system. "What we're witnessing in the case of Miguel Rodriguez is nothing short of institutional child abuse. The state of Arizona wants to drag a severely traumatized 3-year-old girl into this courtroom and force her to relive the most horrific night of her young life, all in the name of securing a conviction against her own father." In the crowd, Detective Sarah Martinez watched with growing anger as Burke painted the prosecution and, by extension, her as heartless monsters, willing to sacrifice an innocent child for their win record. She stood near the back, Rex beside her, both of them off duty, but unable to stay away from the spectacle that their actions had set in motion. Burke was just getting started. He pulled out an enlarged photograph of Emma's drawing one of this disturbing images showing the small figure cowering beneath dark shapes and held it up for the cameras. "This is what trauma looks like in the mind of a 3-year-old. These drawings, created by little Emma Rodriguez, show a child so damaged by police brutality that she can't even speak. And yet, Prosecutor James Chun wants to put her on the witness stand and force her to point fingers at the father who loved her, who was only trying to protect her from a system that has now proven it cares more about convictions than children." The crowd murmured approvingly. Several of the child advocates nodded vigorously, their signs bobbing up and down like weapons in a battle for public opinion. Burke had chosen his battlefield carefully, the courthouse steps at 5 p.m. Perfect timing for the evening news cycle, with lighting that made him look both authoritative and compassionate. The defense has obtained independent psychological evaluations that confirm what any reasonable person can see, Burke continued, producing a thick folder of documents. "Emma Rodriguez is suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, selective mutism, and developmental regression directly caused by watching her father being brutally attacked by a police dog. She hasn't spoken a word in 4 months. She wakes up screaming every night. She's afraid of her own shadow." Martinez felt her jaw clench. She wanted to shout that Rex had saved lives that night, that Miguel Rodriguez had been armed and dangerous, that they'd had no choice. But she also couldn't shake the image of Emma's terrified face, couldn't forget the child's desperate plea. "Don't take my daddy away." Burke's voice rose with righteous indignation. And now, instead of getting this child the help she needs, instead of allowing her to heal in privacy with her loving grandmother, the prosecution wants to traumatize her all over again. They want to parade her in front of cameras, in front of strangers, in front of the very dog that attacked her father. All so they can win a case they should have been able to prove with physical evidence. Dr. Amanda Chun, a child psychologist Burke had hired as an expert witness, stepped forward to the microphone. She was everything the defense could have hoped for: maternal, authoritative, with decades of experience treating traumatized children, and a resume that included testimony in dozens of high-profile cases. "I've reviewed Emma Rodriguez's case extensively," Dr. Chon said, her voice filled with professional concern. "What we're seeing is a textbook case of complex trauma in early childhood. This little girl witnessed her primary caregiver being violently subdued by law enforcement. In her developing mind, the police who children are taught to trust became the source of ultimate terror. The psychological damage may be irreversible if she's forced to confront that trauma again in a courtroom setting. Meanwhile, 6 blocks away in the prosecutor's office, Assistant District Attorney James Chun was watching the press conference on a small television with the sound turned up too loud. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, and his desk was buried under case files, legal briefs, and psychological reports that all pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Without Emma's testimony, his case against Miguel Rodriguez was falling apart. Chun had built his career on putting away drug dealers, and Miguel Rodriguez represented everything he fought against, a man who had chosen his addiction over his daughter's safety, who had turned their home into a drug den, who had endangered his child with every decision he made. But Burke's media campaign was working. Public opinion was shifting, and Chun could feel the political pressure mounting from every direction. His phone rang constantly, now reporters wanting statements, his boss demanding updates, advocacy groups threatening protests if Emma was forced to testify. The hashtag #SaveEmma hashtag had been trending on Twitter for 3 days, with celebrities and politicians weighing in on a case they knew nothing about except what they'd read in headlines. The bottom line, Burke concluded at his press conference, is that Emma Rodriguez has already paid the highest possible price for her father's mistakes. She's lost her mother to an overdose, watched her father being brutally arrested, and now lives in poverty with her elderly grandmother because the state destroyed her family. Enough is enough. Some convictions aren't worth the cost, and this child's mental health is more important than padding anyone's conviction statistics. The crowd erupted in applause as Burke stepped away from the microphones. But Martinez noticed something that others might have missed. Throughout his entire speech, Burke had focused exclusively on Emma's trauma from watching her father's arrest. He had shown her drawings, cited her psychological evaluations, and painted her as a victim of police brutality. But he had never once mentioned the other dogs in Emma's drawings, the ones that suggested she had witnessed something else entirely before the police arrived. Either Burke didn't know about those details, or he was deliberately avoiding them. And if it was the latter, Martinez had to wonder, what was Miguel Rodriguez's own defense attorney trying to hide? As the crowd dispersed and the reporters rushed to file their stories, Martinez made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop defending her actions from that night and start investigating what had really happened before she and Rex arrived at apartment 4B. The defense might be winning the battle for public opinion, but the truth was still out there, hidden in the traumatized mind of a 3-year-old girl who couldn't speak, but whose drawings told a story that nobody was listening to yet. The morning of October 15th dawned gray and ominous over downtown Phoenix, as if the sky itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold inside Courtroom 4A of the Maricopa County Superior Court. By 7 a.m., more than 2 hours before the scheduled 9 a.m. start, a line of reporters, spectators, and protesters stretched around the block. Security guards flanked every entrance, metal detectors hummed constantly, and the courthouse steps resembled a media encampment complete with satellite trucks and news crews from as far away as New York and Los Angeles. Inside the imposing limestone building, Judge Rebecca Thompson sat in her chambers, reviewing the motion filed just hours earlier by defense attorney Michael Burke. The document was a masterpiece of legal strategy and emotional manipulation. Final attempt to have Emma Rodriguez declared incompetent to testify based on her continued mutism and deteriorating psychological condition. Dr. Patricia Hoffman's latest evaluation, submitted as evidence, painted a heartbreaking picture of a child so damaged that even supervised visits with a therapy dog had failed to elicit speech. Judge Thompson had presided over hundreds of cases involving children during her 12 years on the bench, but she had never faced anything quite like this. The legal precedent was murky, while Arizona law generally protected children from testifying in traumatic circumstances. Emma was potentially the only witness who could corroborate the timeline of events that led to her father's arrest. Without her testimony, the prosecution's case relied entirely on physical evidence and the word of police officers whose actions had become the subject of intense public scrutiny. At 8:30 a.m., Rosa Rodriguez arrived at the courthouse carrying Emma in her arms like a much younger child. The 3-year-old had regressed significantly since Burke's press conference 2 weeks ago, refusing to walk on her own and clinging to her grandmother with desperate intensity. Emma wore a simple white dress that Rosa had bought specifically for this day, hoping the innocent color might somehow protect her granddaughter from the harsh realities waiting inside. The moment they entered the building, camera flashes exploded around them, despite strict judicial orders prohibiting photography of the child. Court security immediately surrounded Rosa and Emma, forming a human shield as they navigated through a crowd toward the family waiting area. Emma buried her face against Rosa's shoulder, her small body trembling at the cacophony of voices shouting questions in English and Spanish. "Mrs. Rodriguez, how is Emma feeling today? Will she be able to testify? Do you blame the police for your granddaughter's condition?" Rosa kept her eyes straight ahead, following the bailiff's instructions to ignore the media circus. In her arms, Emma had gone completely rigid, a trauma response Dr. Hoffman had warned might occur in high-stress situations. The child's breathing became shallow and rapid, signs of the panic attacks that had become increasingly frequent as the trial date approached. Across the courthouse, in a separate entrance reserved for law enforcement personnel, Detective Sarah Martinez walked through security with Rex at her side. She wore her dress uniform for the first time in months, the navy blue fabric crisp and formal, her badge polished to a mirror shine. But beneath the professional exterior, Martinez was fighting her own battle with guilt and uncertainty that had intensified since discovering Emma's drawings depicting multiple dogs. Over the past 2 weeks, Martinez had conducted her own unofficial investigation into the events preceding Miguel Rodriguez's arrest. She had re-interviewed neighbors, studied 911 call logs, and even returned to the Sunset Gardens apartment complex after hours to walk through the timeline of that night. What she had discovered troubled her deeply. There were gaps in the official story, inconsistencies that suggested her understanding of the case was incomplete. The neighbor in apartment 4, Mrs. Elena Vasquez, had mentioned something during her initial interview that Martinez was only now beginning to understand. There were so many dogs barking that night, the elderly woman had said, not just during the police raid, but for hours before. Miguel was screaming at someone to control their animals, said they were scaring his little girl. At 9:15 a.m., Judge Thompson entered the packed courtroom with the gravity of someone who understood that her decisions over the next few days would define not only the fate of Miguel Rodriguez, but also the future of a traumatized child whose voice had been silenced by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The gallery was divided like a battlefield, prosecution supporters on one side, defense advocates on the other, with the media occupying every available seat in between. Assistant District Attorney James Chun sat at the prosecution table, his usually confident demeanor replaced by visible tension. His opening statement was prepared, his evidence organized, his witnesses ready. But he knew that, without Emma's testimony, his case was built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence that Burke would systematically demolish. The defense attorney had already filed motions to exclude certain physical evidence, claiming it was obtained during an illegal search conducted after excessive force was used against Miguel Rodriguez. Miguel himself sat at the defense table, wearing an Orange County jail jumpsuit, his hands shackled to a chain around his waist. He had lost significant weight during his months in custody, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow with the unique desperation of a father separated from his child. When he saw Emma enter the courtroom in Rose's arms, his composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he whispered words that the court reporter couldn't capture. But everyone could understand. "Mia, I'm sorry." Emma's reaction to seeing her father was immediate and devastating. The child who had remained silent for 4 months suddenly began making sounds, not words, but keening wails of distress that echoed through the formal courtroom like a siren. She struggled against Rose's arms, reaching toward Miguel with desperate intensity, her cries growing louder and more anguished with each passing second. Judge Thompson immediately called for a 15-minute recess, but the damage was done. Every person in that courtroom, judge, jury, attorneys, spectators, had witnessed the raw agony of a child separated from her father, and the emotional impact was overwhelming. Burke's strategy was working perfectly. Emma's visible distress was more powerful than any opening argument he could have delivered. As court officers worked to calm the situation, and Emma was taken to a private room with Dr. Hoffman, Martinez realized with growing certainty that this trial was about to expose truths that went far beyond Miguel Rodriguez's guilt or innocence. The real question wasn't whether he had committed the crimes he was charged with. The real question was what had happened to him and Emma before the police arrived that night. And sitting somewhere in that packed courtroom might be the people who knew the answer. The third day of testimony began with an eerie calm that veteran court watchers recognized as the quiet before a storm. Judge Rebecca Thompson had spent the previous evening reviewing Emma's psychological evaluations one final time, ultimately deciding that the child would not be called to testify unless absolutely necessary. The ruling had been a devastating blow to prosecutor James John's case, but it had brought visible relief to the packed gallery where child advocates sat alongside Emma's supporters. Detective Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform one last time before entering the witness box. Rex lay in his designated position beside the witness stand, his black and tan coat brushed to perfection, his demeanor calm and professional, despite the circus atmosphere that had surrounded the courthouse for days. Martinez had testified in dozens of cases over her 8-year career, but never under circumstances like these, where every word would be scrutinized, not just for its legal relevance, but for its impact on public opinion. Assistant District Attorney Chun approached the witness stand with the measured confidence of a prosecutor who knew this might be his last chance to salvage the case. His questions were methodical and precise, walking Martinez through the timeline of October 12th from the moment she received the dispatch call to the aftermath of Miguel Rodriguez's arrest. Detective Martinez, Chun began, please describe, for the jury, the condition of apartment 4B when you first entered. Martinez had rehearsed this testimony countless times, but sitting here now, with Emma Rodriguez just 30 feet away in the gallery, the clinical language felt inadequate to describe the chaos they had encountered. The living room contained extensive evidence of drug trafficking activities, she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. We observed approximately 2 ounces of what appeared to be methamphetamine, digital scales, packaging materials, and drug paraphernalia, scattered across multiple surfaces. And the defendant's behavior when you attempted to make contact? Mr. Rodriguez was highly agitated and appeared to be under the influence of controlled substances. He refused repeated commands to surrender and discharged a firearm in the direction of myself and my canine partner. Martinez's eyes briefly met Miguel's across the courtroom. The man looked nothing like the wild-eyed drug dealer she had encountered that night. Prison had aged him, but it had also stripped away the desperate mania that had made him so dangerous. Chun continued his examination, establishing the timeline and justifying the use of Rex to subdue an armed suspect. But Martinez found herself distracted by something she hadn't noticed during the previous 2 days of testimony. Emma's behavior was different today. Instead of the withdrawn, traumatized silence that had characterized her courtroom appearances, the little girl seemed alert, almost anticipatory. She kept glancing toward the witness stand, where Rex lay motionless, her dark eyes showing the first spark of interest anyone had seen in months. "Detective Martinez," Sean continued, "did you have any reason to believe there were other individuals in the apartment that night?" It was a routine question, one they had practiced during preparation sessions, but Martinez hesitated. Mrs. Vasquez's words echoed in her mind. There were so many dogs barking that night, ... for hours before. She looked at Emma again, noting how the child's attention was completely focused on Rex, and made a decision that would change everything. "Based on my investigation at the scene that night, I believed Mr. Rodriguez was alone with his daughter," Martinez said carefully. "However, subsequent interviews with neighbors have suggested there may have been additional circumstances I wasn't initially aware of." Defense attorney Michael Burke shot to his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is speculating based on inadmissible hearsay." Judge Thompson sustained the objection, but the damage was done. Martinez had planted a seed of doubt about the official narrative, and every person in that courtroom, especially Burke, understood the implications. Sean looked confused and slightly panicked, clearly wondering why his star witness was deviating from their prepared script. "Let me rephrase," Sean said, trying to regain control. "Based on your observations that night, was there any physical evidence suggesting other individuals had been present in the apartment?" Martinez took a deep breath. "At the time, I was focused on securing the scene and ensuring the safety of the child. However, reviewing my notes later, I did observe what appeared to be dog hair that was inconsistent with my partner's breed and coloring." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Burke was on his feet again, but Judge Thompson waved him down. In the gallery, Emma Rodriguez suddenly sat up straighter, her eyes widening as she stared directly at Rex. For the first time since entering the courthouse, she wasn't cowering or hiding her face against her grandmother's shoulder. Chun, realizing his case was spiraling beyond his control, decided to cut his losses. "No further questions, Your Honor." Burke approached the witness, stand like a predator sensing wounded prey. His cross-examination would be brutal, Martinez knew, designed to destroy her credibility and paint her as a trigger-happy cop who had traumatized an innocent child. But something unexpected happened as Burke began his attack. Emma Rodriguez stood up. It was such a small action that most people in the courtroom didn't notice at first. Rosa tried to pull her granddaughter back into her seat, but Emma resisted with a determination no one had seen from her in months. She stepped into the aisle, her tiny white dress a stark contrast to the formal darkness of the courtroom, and began walking toward the witness stand. "Emma, no," Rosa whispered urgently, but the child continued forward with purposeful steps that silenced the murmuring crowd. Bailiffs moved to intercept her, but Judge Thompson raised her hand, sensing that something significant was about to occur. Emma walked past the prosecution table, past the defense table where her father sat with tears streaming down his face, and stopped directly in front of the witness stand. She was close enough now to reach out and touch Rex, who remained perfectly still but alert, his trained instincts telling him that this moment was important. The entire courtroom held its breath. Emma raised her small hand and pointed directly at Rex, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to speak. Her grandmother had risen from her seat. Dr. Hoffman was making her way down the aisle, and every camera in the room was focused on the 3-year-old girl who hadn't spoken in 4 months. Martinez leaned forward in the witness chair, her heart pounding as she realized that Emma wasn't just looking at Rex, she was recognizing him. Not as the dog who had attacked her father, but as the dog who had been there that night. The dog she remembered from before the chaos, before the violence, before everything went wrong. Emma's lips moved soundlessly, and Martinez found herself holding her breath, along with everyone else in the courtroom, waiting for the words that would either save or destroy them all. The moment stretched endlessly, balanced on the edge of revelation, as a traumatized child prepared to break her silence in a way that no one, not her family, not the lawyers, not the press, could have possibly anticipated. The truth was about to emerge from the most unlikely source imaginable, and it would change everything they thought they knew about the night that destroyed Emma Rodriguez's world. Time seemed suspended in courtroom 4A as Emma Rodriguez stood before the witness stand, her tiny finger pointing directly at Rex, while her mouth moved soundlessly. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on the child with an expression that seemed almost protective. Detective Sarah Martinez leaned forward in the witness chair, her heart hammering against her ribs, as she watched the little girl struggle to find her voice after 4 months of traumatic silence. Judge Rebecca Thompson had frozen with her gavel halfway raised, recognizing that this moment transcended normal courtroom procedure. The packed gallery held its collective breath, reporters, with pens poised over notebooks, child advocates clutching their signs, family members with tears already forming in their eyes. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing, her fingers hovering motionless over the keys as everyone waited for Emma to speak. Rosa Rodriguez had risen from her seat and was moving slowly down the aisle, her weathered hands extended toward her granddaughter. "Mia," she whispered, using the Spanish endearment that had once made Emma giggle with delight. "It's okay, baby. You don't have to." But Emma shook her head with surprising determination, never taking her eyes off Rex. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who had been observing from the back of the courtroom, recognized the signs immediately. Emma wasn't having a breakdown or panic attack. She was having a breakthrough. The child's posture was different, more focused and intentional than anyone had seen since that terrible night in October. At the defense table, Michael Burke sat frozen with his cross-examination notes scattered before him, realizing that his carefully orchestrated strategy was about to be demolished by the very child he had spent weeks protecting from testifying. Miguel Rodriguez was sobbing openly, his shackled hands pressed against his mouth as he watched his daughter prepare to speak for the first time since his arrest. Emma took a deep, shuddering breath that seemed too large for her small frame. Her finger remained pointed at Rex, but her expression began to change. The blank, traumatized stare that had defined her for months was being replaced by something else: recognition, memory, and perhaps most importantly, the desperate need to be understood. "Good," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible in the silent courtroom. The word came out cracked and rusty from months of disuse, but it was unmistakably clear. Judge Thompson leaned forward, straining to hear, while the court reporter frantically adjusted her equipment. Martinez felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized what Emma was trying to say. The child wasn't afraid of Rex. She was remembering him differently than everyone had assumed. Emma took another breath, her voice growing slightly stronger, with effort and determination that was heartbreaking to witness. "Good doggy," Emma said, her 2 words falling into the courtroom silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond these walls. The gallery erupted. Reporters began frantically scribbling notes. Photographers raised their cameras, despite judicial prohibitions, and spectators whispered urgent conversations to their neighbors. But Emma wasn't finished. Having found her voice after so many months, the words began tumbling out in a rush of memory, an emotion that no one could stop. "Bad doggies hurt Daddy," she said, turning to look directly at her father for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Big bad doggies bite Daddy before good doggy come." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Burke was on his feet shouting objections. Chun was demanding order, while frantically trying to process this unexpected testimony, and Judge Thompson was banging her gavel repeatedly. But Emma continued speaking, her small voice growing stronger as suppressed memories poured out of her. "Scary men with big doggies come to house," she said, her words becoming clearer as the trauma that had locked away her speech began to dissolve. "They say Daddy owe money. They say bad doggies gonna hurt Emma if Daddy no give money." Martinez felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Emma's drawings showing multiple dogs, the neighbors' reports of dogs barking for hours before the police arrived, Miguel's injuries that had been attributed to resisting arrest. It all made sense now. The child hadn't been traumatized by watching her father's arrest. She had been traumatized by watching him being tortured by loan sharks who had used attack dogs as weapons. Miguel Rodriguez was screaming now, his voice echoing off the courtroom. "Walls, she's telling the truth. They came to collect money I owed them. I tried to hide Emma, but she saw everything. The dogs, there were 3 of them. They kept attacking me while Emma was crying in the closet." Judge Thompson was banging her gavel so hard that Martinez feared it might break. Order, order in this court. But the revelation was too explosive to contain. Emma, having finally found her voice, seemed determined to tell the entire story that had been trapped inside her traumatized mind. "Good doggy saved Daddy," Emma said, pointing again at Rex with something approaching affection. "Good doggy chased bad doggies away. Good police lady helped Daddy." The courtroom fell silent again as the full implications of Emma's testimony sank in. She hadn't been afraid of Rex, she had been grateful to him. In her 3-year-old mind, the police dog who had subdued her father wasn't the source of her trauma, but the hero who had ended it. Rex had arrived just in time to save Miguel from the loan shark's attack dogs, and Emma knew it. Dr. Hoffman had reached the front of the courtroom now and knelt beside Emma, speaking in soothing tones. "You're being so brave, sweetheart. Can you tell us about the men who brought the bad dogs?" Emma nodded eagerly, the words flowing more freely now that the dam of silence had finally burst. 3 scary men. One had snake picture on arm. They say Daddy have to pay or Emma gonna get hurt too. Bad doggies growl at Emma, make her hide under bed. Martinez realized with growing horror that they had all been investigating the wrong crime. Miguel Rodriguez wasn't just a drug dealer who had resisted arrest. He was a victim of violent extortion who had been brutally tortured in front of his daughter. The drugs in his apartment, his erratic behavior, his injuries, everything took on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of Emma's testimony. Burke was frantically conferring with his client. Sean was shuffling through papers with the expression of a man whose entire case had just collapsed, and Judge Thompson was trying to restore order to a courtroom that had been turned upside down by the truth spoken by a 3-year-old child. But Emma wasn't finished. Having broken her months-long silence, she had one more revelation that would shatter everything they thought they knew about the night that changed her life forever. 6 months after Emma Rodriguez's courtroom revelation shattered the case against her father, the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office looked like a war zone of legal documents, evidence boxes, and federal investigation files. The Phoenix Police Department had launched a major task force targeting loan sharking operations, and 3 men were now facing charges for extortion, assault, and weapons violations based on Emma's testimony and subsequent investigation. The snake tattoo she had described led investigators directly to Carlos Serpiente Mendoza, a known associate of the Sinaloa cartel who used trained attack dogs to collect debts from desperate addicts. Assistant District Attorney James Chun sat in his office, no longer fighting to convict Miguel Rodriguez, but working instead to ensure the man received the help he needed to rebuild his life. The drug charges had been reduced to simple possession, with mandatory rehabilitation and Miguel was scheduled to be released from county jail within the week. The transformation in Chun's perspective had been profound, from seeing Miguel as a criminal who endangered his child to understanding him as a father who had been trapped by circumstances beyond his control. The psychological evaluation shows significant improvement, Dr. Patricia Hoffman reported during their weekly case conference. Miguel's been clean for 6 months now. He's completed anger management courses, and he's demonstrated genuine commitment to creating a stable environment. For Emma, the family reunification plan should move forward. Detective Sarah Martinez knocked on Sean's office door, Rex at her side as always. Over the past months, the German Shepherd had become something of a celebrity in Phoenix, featured in news stories about the case and lauded as the hero dog, who had inadvertently saved both Miguel and Emma Rodriguez. But Martinez knew the real hero was a 3-year-old girl who had found the courage to break her silence and tell the truth. "How is she doing?" Martinez asked, settling into the chair across from Chun's desk. She had been visiting Emma regularly, bringing Rex along for what Dr. Hoffman now called therapeutic K9 sessions. The bond between the child and the police. Dog had been remarkable to witness. Emma now saw Rex as her protector and friend, the good dog who had chased away the bad ones. "She's talking constantly now," Chun said with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Rosa says she can barely keep up with all the questions. Emma wants to know about everything: why the sky is blue, where butterflies go in the winter, whether Rex has a favorite color. It's like she's making up for all those months of silence." The media attention had finally died down, though Emma's story continued to resonate across the country. Child advocacy groups had used her case to push for better protection of minors. In the legal system, while law enforcement agencies were implementing new protocols for investigating domestic disturbances involving children, the #SaveEmma hashtag had evolved into a broader movement supporting traumatized children, with Rosa Rodriguez becoming an unlikely spokesperson for families affected by violence. Martinez's phone buzzed with a text message from Rosa. "Emma wants to show Rex her new drawings. Can you visit this afternoon?" The detective smiled, remembering the stark contrast between Emma's current artwork: bright pictures of flowers, rainbows, and yes, friendly dogs, and the dark, traumatic images she had created during her months of silence. The federal case against the loan shark ring goes to trial next month, Chun continued. "Emma won't have to testify. We have enough physical evidence and adult witness testimony to convict." But she told Dr. Hoffman she wants to write a letter to the judge, thanking Rex for protecting her gaddy. 3 blocks away, in a modest apartment that Rosa had been able to afford, thanks to donations from strangers touched by Emma's story, the little girl was indeed creating new artwork. But these drawings told a different story, one of healing, hope, and family reunification. She had drawn herself holding hands with both her father and grandmother, with Rex sitting proudly beside them like a faithful guardian. "Daddy comes home tomorrow," Emma announced to her grandmother as she added purple flowers to her latest masterpiece. Her vocabulary had expanded dramatically, and her speech patterns were now typical for a bright 4-year-old. "Are we gonna have a party?" Rosa wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her granddaughter color with the focused intensity of childhood. The transformation had been miraculous, from a silent, traumatized shell to this vibrant, curious little girl who filled their home with laughter and constant chatter. The nightmares had stopped months ago, replaced by dreams about puppies and playgrounds. When Martinez arrived that afternoon with Rex, Emma ran to greet them with the uninhibited joy of a child who no longer feared the world around her. She had grown taller, her face had filled out from regular meals, and her eyes sparkled with the intelligence and mischief that trauma had temporarily stolen from her. "Detective Sarah, Rex!" Emma shouted, throwing her arms around the German Shepherd's neck. Rex tolerated the enthusiastic greeting with patient dignity, his tail wagging as Emma kissed the top of his head. "I drawed you a picture. It's you and me and Daddy, all happy together." The drawing was indeed happy stick figures with enormous smiles, standing under a bright yellow sun, with Rex depicted as a friendly dog with a gold badge drawn on his chest. At the bottom, in Emma's careful 4-year-old handwriting, were they words that had started this entire journey. "Good doggy Rex. Miguel's release is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Martinez told Rosa quietly, while Emma played with Rex in the living room. "Are you ready for this?" Rosa nodded, though Martinez could see the mixture of hope and anxiety in her weathered face. "Emma talks about him every day. She's forgiven him completely, the way only children can. But I worry about whether he can forgive himself." The next morning, Maricopa County Jail processed the release of inmate number 47,291, Miguel Rodriguez, father, recovering addict, and survivor of a brutal extortion scheme that had nearly destroyed his family. He emerged into the Arizona sunshine, carrying a small bag of belongings and a folder full of letters from his daughter, each one decorated with hearts and flowers and signed, "Love, Emma." Rosa and Emma waited in the parking lot, the little girl bouncing with excitement while clutching a handmade "Welcome Home, Daddy" banner. When Miguel saw his daughter running toward him, his carefully controlled composure finally cracked. He fell to his knees and wrapped her in his arms, both of them crying as they held each other for the first time in 10 months. "I missed you so much, Daddy," Emma whispered against his chest. "But don't worry, the good doggies kept you safe, and now you're home." Miguel looked over his daughter's head to see Detective Martinez and Rex watching from a respectful distance. The police officer who had arrested him, whose dog had pinned him to the ground, whose actions had separated him from his child. She was also the woman whose investigation had ultimately saved his life and exposed the real criminals who had terrorized his family. Their eyes met across the parking lot, and Miguel nodded slightly, a gesture of gratitude, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, forgiveness. Martinez nodded back, Rex sitting calmly beside her, both of them knowing they had witnessed something profound, the healing power of truth spoken by a child who had found her voice again. Emma Rodriguez would grow up remembering the night that changed everything, not as a source of trauma, but as the night a good dog and a brave police officer saved her daddy. And in a world that often seemed dark and complicated, that simple truth was enough to build a future on. The silent witness had finally told her story, and justice imperfect but real had been served.